June 6, 1944, 0540 hours. The English Channel 6,000 yards off Omaha Beach. Yellow flags snap up on 8 landing craft. Ramps drop. 33-ton Sherman tanks wrapped in canvas screens that make them look like oversized bathtubs roll forward into the heaving grey sea. The first tank off LCT 600 paddles towards shore for about 100 yards, then it vanishes beneath the surface. Within 30 minutes, 27 of 29 tanks launched from the 741st Tank Battalion have sunk to the bottom of the channel. Crews claw at waterlogged canvas, fight suction from sinking steel, and gasp for air through emergency breathing sets designed to give them 5 minutes of oxygen. Some make it to the surface, some do not. Here is what makes this disaster unforgivable. On the same morning, in the same sea, using the same tanks built to the same British design, crews at Sword Beach put 31 of 34 DD Shermans onto the sand. At Utah, 27 of 28 made it ashore. The technology worked. British engineering had solved the impossible problem of making a tank float. What failed at Omaha was not the invention, it was the decision-making of the men who used it. The problem was simple to describe and devastating in practice. Every amphibious invasion in the war faced the same lethal gap. Infantry hit the beach with rifles and grenades. Tanks arrived later on landing craft. In the minutes between, soldiers had no armoured support against fortified positions, concrete bunkers, and machine gun nests. At Dieppe in 1942, Canadian infantry crossed open beaches without tank support for agonizing minutes. The result was a massacre. Over 900 Canadians died, and nearly 2,000 were captured. The Germans understood this vulnerability and built their Atlantic Wall defences around it. At Omaha specifically, the bluffs overlooking the beach contained 8 concrete bunkers, 35 pillboxes, 18 anti-tank guns, and 85 machine gun positions. Every one of those positions was designed to slaughter infantry in the open during those first minutes before armour arrived. The question that British engineers needed to answer was this: how do you get a tank onto a beach at the same time as the infantry, without a landing craft that makes an enormous target for shore batteries? Nicholas Straussler, a Hungarian-born British citizen, had been wrestling with this question since 1927. His early designs used collapsible floats bolted to the sides of tanks, but they were as big as the vehicle itself, impractical. By 1934, he abandoned that approach entirely and conceived something far more elegant: a collapsible canvas screen attached to a steel platform welded around the tank hull at mudguard level. When inflated by compressed air, the screen rose to a height of 12 feet 6 inches, displacing enough water to float 33 tons of steel. 36 rubber tubes exerted roughly 600 pounds of upward pressure each, producing about 12 tons of total lift. 2 brass propellers, around 28 inches in diameter, bolted to the rear and driven by the tank engine through crown wheel gears, pushed the vehicle through water at 4 knots. That is walking pace. The name Duplex Drive referred to this dual propulsion: propellers in the sea and tracks on land. Soldiers nicknamed it the Donald Duck, after the DD initials. According to Straussler's own engineering notes preserved at the Tank Museum in Bovington, the system was designed for a maximum sea state of force 3, with waves no higher than 2 feet. The freeboard, meaning the distance between the waterline and the top of the canvas screen, was approximately 3 feet. Anything higher than that poured straight into the tank. Major William Duncan, who ran the American DD training school in Devon, wrote in a classified assessment dated April 30th, 1944, that any force C with waves of 2 feet or more were, in his words, very dangerous. The system was a marvel of British engineering. It was also unforgiving of overconfidence. Major General Percy Hobart, recalled from the Home Guard by Churchill himself, took command of the 79th Armoured Division in March of 1943 and turned it into the parent unit for every specialist assault vehicle Britain would field on D-Day. Hobart did not invent the DD tank. That was Straussler's achievement entirely. What Hobart did was train 10 regiments in its use and develop the doctrine that would determine whether the tanks lived or died. His training pipeline ran crews through freshwater trials at Fritton Lake in Norfolk, then saltwater exercises at Stokes Bay on the Solent. British regiments had their DD Shermans from mid-1943. They trained for a full year before Normandy. Now, before we see what happened when these tanks met the real channel, if you're enjoying this deep dive into British engineering, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Right. Let us get into the disaster. At Omaha Beach, 2 American tank battalions carried DD Shermans. The 741st was assigned the eastern sector. The 743rd covered the western sector. Both carried 32 DD tanks each. Rear Admiral Hall's operation order set a default launch distance of 6,000 yards. The order acknowledged that seas might be unsuitable, but it failed to establish who had the authority to cancel the launch, or at what point that decision should be made. This was the fatal flaw. British doctrine gave local commanders clear authority to adapt on the spot. The American plan had no such mechanism. At around 0505 hours, two conversations happened simultaneously on parallel lines of landing craft. On the western side, Captain Ned Elder of the 743rd looked at the 4 to 6 foot swells pounding his LCT and made a decision. He told his naval counterpart, Lieutenant Dean Rockwell, that his tanks would not swim. All 32 would ride their landing craft directly to the sand. On the eastern side, Captain James Thornton of the 741st radioed Captain Charles Young. According to the 741st's after-action report, both commanders agreed that the advantage to be gained by launching justified the risk. At 0540, 29 tanks rolled into the channel. The sea conditions were roughly double the design limit. Waves averaged 3 to 4 feet with occasional crests of 6 feet. Wind blew 10 to 18 knots from the northwest. Directly on shore, a strong lateral current pushed the swimming tanks eastward, forcing them broadside to the waves, the most dangerous possible orientation. The first tank sank within 100 yards. Ensign Henry Sullivan, commanding LCT 600, watched it disappear and made the decision to stop launching his remaining 3 tanks. He carried them to shore instead. Across the other 7 craft, tank after tank went under. Broken struts, torn canvas, engines choked with salt water. Of 29 launched, 27 sank. Only 2 reached the beach under their own power. Commanded by Sergeant George Geddes and Staff Sergeant Turner Shepherd, the crews were equipped with emergency breathing apparatus, life vests, inflatable rafts, and large knives for cutting through canvas. Most men stood on deck during the swim rather than inside the hull, which gave them a fighting chance to escape. The 741st's after-action report states that the majority of crews reached the surface and were rescued by small craft. The exact number who drowned during the sinkings, as opposed to later combat on the beach, remains disputed. The battalion lost 45 killed across the entire day, but how many died in the water versus on the sand is genuinely unclear. The image of 5 men sealed inside a steel coffin sinking to the bottom is largely inaccurate as a general description, since most crew were topside, but the driver, enclosed in the hull, was the most vulnerable, and the collapsing canvas could trap anyone it tangled around, while 33 tons of sinking metal created suction strong enough to drag a swimmer under. Now compare Omaha to what happened on the British beaches. At Sword, the 13th 18th Royal Hussar launched from 5,000 yards after their flotilla officer closed the distance from the originally planned 7,000. Major Derek Wormold reported that all tanks were launched after closing to 5,000 yards, and that the sea looked alarming from the craft, but the decision to float proved correct. Over 90% reached the sand. They arrived 5 to 7 minutes before the infantry, exactly as designed. Lance Corporal Patrick Hennessy described the swim as an hour of battering through rough seas. Then, within a minute of dropping the screen, his crew fired their first shot. At Juneau, the Canadian 1st Hussars launched 19 tanks from 4,000 yards. 14 reached shore ahead of the Regina Rifle Regiment. 5 sank, including Major Duncan's tank. Sergeant Leo Garriepi watched it vanish. With 4 heads bobbing in the water, the crew survived. The Fort Garry Horse refused to launch at sea entirely, and all their tanks were landed directly. At Gold, the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards abandoned the 5,000-yard plan due to choppy conditions and landed directly on the beach. At Utah, the 70th Tank Battalion, combat veterans from North Africa, launched 28 tanks from just 1,000 yards. 27 made it. The pattern is undeniable. Where commanders adapted, the tanks survived. Where rigid planning met reality and nobody had authority to override, men died. Captain Elder, who saved the 743rd, had been an instructor at the DD training school itself. He understood the limits of the canvas screen the way a pilot understands a stall speed. Captain Thornton lacked that intimate knowledge. Elder was killed in action less than 2 weeks later, leaving behind a new bride and a son he would never meet. The aftermath revealed the full cost of the decision gap. Omaha Beach suffered an estimated 2,400 to 3,700 casualties on D-Day. The loss of armoured support during the critical first hour was a major contributing factor. German machine gunner Heinrich Severloh at position WN62 fired throughout the morning with virtually no Allied tanks suppressing him. He only retreated in the afternoon when Shermans from Elder's 743rd, the battalion that had landed directly, appeared from the west. At Sword Beach, Wormold's DD tanks suppressed the defences so effectively that, in his own report, the 2 assault infantry companies crossed the beach without being fired on by small arms. The Canadians at Juneau credited the 1st Hussars with making possible the overwhelming of the defences. Beyond D-Day, DD tanks proved their worth repeatedly. They crossed the Western Scheldt in October of 1944. They swam the Rhine in March of 1945 during Operation Plunder. The Staffordshire Yeomanry made the last combat swimming operation of the war at the River Elbe on April 29, 1945. The design was improved after Normandy with a strengthened Mark II version featuring an extended screen, better bilge pumps, and self-locking struts. Over 1,000 Sherman DD conversions were produced across Britain and America, a tribute to the manufacturing simplicity of Straussler's canvas and rubber system. Today, at least 22 confirmed DD tank wrecks rest on the seabed off Omaha Beach. Their gun barrels still point toward the shore they never reached. At the Tank Museum in Bovington, a single M4A 2DD Sherman sits with its original canvas screen intact, the only surviving example with its flotation system preserved. At Courseulles-sur-Mer in Normandy, the Canadian tank Bold, recovered from the sea in 1971, stands in a square named after Sergeant Gary Eppie. The DD Sherman was not a failure. It was a British invention that worked exactly as designed, when operated within its limits, and by commanders given the authority to adapt. On 4 beaches, it delivered tanks ahead of the infantry and saved lives. On 1 beach, rigid planning, inadequate authority structures, and a launch into seas double the design maximum turned a British engineering triumph into an American tragedy. The canvas held when the commanders did their jobs. 27 tanks sit on the bottom of the channel because on one stretch of Norman coastline nobody had the power to say no.